The sword of Godric Gryffindor in the movies was totally wrong. What kind of sword should Godric Gryffindor have actually had? Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm basically a swords and arms and armour and martial arts expert, aficionado, whatever you want to call me. And I've been asked many times what type of sword, you might think that's not true, but it actually is, what type of sword should Godric Gryffindor have had? And the reason people ask me is because most people realise that in a lot of the movies, but also fan art and stuff, the types of swords shown in the hands of Godric Gryffindor are basically wrong, so or like implausible. So what type of sword should Godric Gryffindor have actually had? And in fact, most recently, follower of the channel Angel Hurtado, shout out to you, posted this very question asking me what sort of sword should Godric Gryffindor's sword have been. First thing that we can say is that this example shown in the movies is based on an 18th century what's called a pillow sword. It's a type of dress sword from centuries and centuries later, after when Godric Gryffindor is supposed to have existed and lived. So it's really a poor choice, and also in a sort of early medieval context it just doesn't look like an early medieval sword. Yes, okay, it's supposed to be goblin made, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but the fact is it just doesn't look right for the period from when Godric Gryffindor is supposed to be from. Why did they choose that weird design of sword for Godric Gryffindor's sword? I can only assume it was partially because they just didn't care. They didn't care about the sword design, or they didn't know anything about sword design, so they didn't bother asking anyone who knows about historical swords. But also I suspect it was because Daniel Radcliffe had to be able to wield the sword, and therefore it had to be pretty light, and so they went with something that was fairly small and fairly narrow, but it doesn't really fit with what we know about Godric Gryffindor. So what do we actually know about Godric Gryffindor? Well, according to the lore, he was a founder of Hogwarts, one of the 4 founders, and he existed in the 10th century and almost certainly into the 11th century. So we're talking about the 900s and 1000s, if you want to call them that. Okay, so around 1000 AD, and we know an awful lot about the swords of that period, but we'll come to that in a second. If we actually look at his background and lore, he is supposed to have been a famous duelist, okay? Or that's interesting. Secondly, he's also supposed to have used a sword and a wand, and because he extolled virtue and virtues such as bravery and fair play, fairness, these types of things, sportsmanship, he believed in fighting muggles, which he did apparently, according to the lore, fight lots of muggles with swords and magicians with wands. So he was a famous duelist both with wands against magicians and a sword against muggles. And allegedly he used both. As far as I know, we don't know if he used them both together, which if he did, it would be a little bit like the comparison of using a sword and a revolver, like we have in the 19th century. But if he used both together or both separately, the fact is he was famous for fighting with swords against muggles. That means that he must have been able to hold his own with a sword in a sword fight against muggles enough to be renowned to have been a good duelist. Now we'll come back to the history in a second because it's important for that point. But now if we skip forward to the fact that, is this a magical sword? Yes, kind of. Okay, so allegedly the magical sword absorbs some of the powers of the people or things that it defeats. Hence, it is believed that the powers of the basilisk are absorbed from the basilisk when... Sorry, spoilers, if you haven't read the Harry Potter books, you probably won't be watching this video. But, spoiler alert warning here. So, when the sword is used to kill the basilisk, it is believed that it absorbs some of the powers of the basilisk, and that enables Harry to use it effectively against Voldemort. I won't give more spoilers there. But, so it is a magical sword. That kind of puts it outside slightly of the normal judgment of what type of sword it should be here. Also, it's goblin made, and it's described as being bejeweled. So that's also a little bit unusual. It's goblin made, so it's not human made. So it could be a different design. So completely off the bat, before I go into what historical design should it be like, the fact is that the sword of Godric Gryffindor could be anything. So in fact the sword that they use, while I think it's inappropriate and it doesn't look right, the sword that they use in the movies, you could argue that it's correct purely from that point of view. Number 1, it's a magical sword. Number 2, it's goblin made. So it could look like anything. It could look like any fantasy sword you like. However, You want an answer of what type of sword should it be for this period? Well, firstly, it's not this sword. Or is it? What I'm actually holding here is a Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, leaf-bladed sword, made by Neil Burridge in this case, of Bronze Age swords. And theoretically, we don't know if Godric Gryffindor's sword is actually from his time. And this is something, as I'm a former archaeologist and medieval historian, this is a really important point to note, okay? A coin, which is found in the ground, only tells you that that site predates that postdates that coin. That coin could have been, say we've got a modern coin dating to 1950. That coin could have gone into the ground any time after 1950. Okay, but it can't have gone into the ground before 1950. So a Roman coin in a site doesn't tell you it's a Roman site. It just tells you that site is Roman or after that, okay? So it's the same with the sword of Godric Gryffindor. It's possible that he had an old ancestral sword. So just because he existed in the 900s or 1000s, it doesn't mean that he has to have a sword from his own lifetime. It could be older than that, okay? So indeed, it could have been a Bronze Age sword, it could have been a Roman sword, it could have been an earlier medieval sword from the 400s or 500s, a Sparta, okay? But if we assume that the sword of Godric Gryffindor is from his own time, then what were the swords in Britain, so in Northwest Europe, in the 900s and 1000s? Well, essentially we're talking about the Viking era, okay, or late Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, so on and so forth. So we're looking at swords like this. They have Sparta-like blades, they are broad, chopping blades, they have relatively spatulated tips, so they're not particularly acutely pointed. They are broad cleaving blades intended to be used with a shield, incidentally, and relatively short guards, and various forms of lobed and T-junction pommels, okay, so pommels that project out sideways like this. Now, in this period, interestingly, so as we go into the 1000s, indeed, you do start to get swords that look more like a typical medieval sword. The crossguard gets longer. It can either be curved or it can be straight, but the crossguards start to get longer, and the pommels, for the most part, start to get a bit smaller and a little bit more, should we say, ball or blob-shaped. Not quite wheel pommels yet, but they start to become more rounded. Some would say slightly more ergonomic for the type of swordsmanship which most people are used to using. However, these earlier sort of grips really lock your hand in, but they also force you to cut in certain ways, usually, conventionally. So, the basic answer is that the type of sword that we would expect to see Godric Gryffindor using in the 900s and 1000s would be comparable to Viking era swords that we see in the Frankish, Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian Norse kingdoms of this time, or possibly an earlier form of longer cross-hilted sword, although I would say that's a little bit after Godric Gryffindor's time. And we know that he has the same sword. It is the sword of Godric Gryffindor. But I'll just remind you that this could also be an older sword. So if he lived in the 900s, was born in the 900s, it could have been a sword from the 800s, the 700s, in which case it would look like a Viking era sword. It could have been an earlier sword, an earlier Anglo-Saxon sword, for example. I think he was an Anglo-Saxon, Godric Gryffindor, so it could have been something like the Sutton Hoo sword, which is an earlier ancestor of Viking-era swords that we could sort of call related to the Roman Sparta. That's a whole nother topic. So, to conclude, Godric Gryffindor, if he was using a conventional sword of his time, it should have been a sword somewhat like this, a Viking-era, broad-bladed, Type 10, if you want to use oakshot typology, cleaving blade. Nothing like the sword shown in the movies. But coming back to the lore and the personality of the person, essentially, in his sort of his imagined history, he is supposed to be a famous duelist, okay? And equally, there's no mention of him using shields. And he uses a wand, so perhaps a shield wouldn't be very convenient to use. If he only used a sword, you could argue that he might possibly go with a different type of sword, maybe a slightly narrower than normal sword, so that it would be more nimble and things like this, because he wasn't using it with a shield. And these swords pretty much are evolved to be used with shields. Not to say everyone always used shields all the time in the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish era. In period art, we do see them using these swords without shields sometimes, so it could just be that Godric Gryffindor was a badass with a sword, used a conventional style sword, but he used it without a shield. Or maybe he did use a shield and it's just not written about. So some further things to think about, and finally I would mention that unfortunately, because we've got that goblin-made element and the fact that it is a magical sword, you could say it looked like anything. But I would say if I was designing the props for the movie, I would choose a Viking era sword because that's the period from which Godric Gryffindor came. I hope this has been useful and interesting. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.